Good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to you wherever you may be. My name is Wajahat Saeed Khan. I'm a journalist based here in New York City, covering Pakistan and the rest of South Asia. Most of my broadcasts on my YouTube channel are in Urdu, but from time to time, when the topic is right and of importance, I delve into English for a larger global audience. And the topic today is definitely one of larger importance. It is the first of a multi part series dedicated to understanding the mighty ISI, Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence Directorate, its premier intelligence agency. The ISI is a lot of things to a lot of people, but for most students of Pakistani politics and history, it is effectively the state within the state. The ISI makes the rules, and the ISI breaks the rules in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. For years, its impact has been felt from the Mumbai attacks in India to the fall of Kabul just a few years ago, when the Americans were effectively pushed out of Afghanistan after suffering there for almost 2 decades. But Pakistan's connection to the ISI goes all the way back to its inception, to the late 1940s when the intelligence agency was founded, and right up till present day. But in today's episode, we focus on its first 10 years. Why? Because those first 10 years were foundational, they were of critical importance. The ISI started off, of course, as just a coordinating agency for field intelligence for Pakistan's three armed services. But it was during those years that it started delving into politics as well. And that's what we will cover today. Again, this is independent journalism trying to do its thing. You will not find this anywhere else on YouTube. This is based on open source reporting from academic sources. We will cite where we can. And the whole idea is to educate a larger audience of Pakistani students, people who study Pakistan's diplomatic and political and military history, and of course, general watchers of the South Asia region. Again, I'm Wajahat Saeed Khan, and you are watching Mahaz, but this time in English. Here we go. So, the history of the ISI is shaped by war. The first Kashmir War of 1947 to 1948 had just wrapped up, and not necessarily in Pakistan's favor, when the ISI was effectively raised. Now, some themes were set which are still followed. The first Kashmir War saw irregular warfare in the valley of Kashmir. By irregular warfare, well, there was a lot of fighting, but not necessarily between uniformed combatants. Certain planners in Pakistan's military thought that to avoid diplomatic flack, as well as to have plausible deniability about using Pashtun tribesmen from the northwest frontier, the Pakistanis decided that many irregular or guerrilla fighters would end up going to Kashmir to foment an insurgency there. Didn't really work out in their favor as they wanted to. The Kashmiri Maharaja still signed a document which India claims that was the document of accession upon which India continues to occupy modern day Jammu and Kashmir, or at least most of modern day Jammu and Kashmir. Yes, Pakistan retained some of the Kashmir region. They call it the Azad Kashmir region or independent Kashmir. That is, of course, just a formality. It is effectively a part of Pakistan's overall ambit and protected by Pakistani security forces. But irregular warfare thematic effectively became part of the Kashmir Front, premised on the marginal gains and mostly losses in the Kashmir War. The defense bosses of Pakistan at the time decided to raise the ISI primarily for coordinating intelligence, field intelligence between Pakistan's different armed forces. Now, keep in mind that what's important to know that this was right in the middle of 1948, when the Kashmir War, the first Kashmir War, had ended, and a UN sponsored ceasefire had been implemented in the region. However, the ISI, when it was formed, was not called the ISI. In fact, it was called the Directorate of Forces Intelligence because of that very ambit. Now, documentation on this is pretty unclear, but it can be assessed that soon after it was called the Directorate of Forces Intelligence, or DFI, the ISI became the ISI. And again, the name was very functional. Inter-Services Intelligence. The whole idea was to promote and coordinate intelligence gathering and intelligence processing between Pakistan's three services, thus inter-services. Now, let's talk about leadership. Now, at that time, till now, the premise has been that the CGS, who is the right-hand man of the Chief of Army Staff, who at that time was called the Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Army, the CGS, effectively the number 2 guy in the army, decided to make the call and raise the DFI, aka the ISI. Now, his name was Lieutenant General Ross Cairns Mackay. He was a retired Australian Army officer. He'd fought in the Battle of Somme, in Belgium. He'd been injured. He's a decorated officer, and he'd been retired but hired by the Pakistani military. Now, why were the Pakistanis hiring a bunch of Australian and British military officers at the time? Well, there was a deficit of officers. There weren't enough officers in the Pakistan Army. The partition was a strange beast by a strange concoction and even more strange formulae. The idea was to split up the Indian subcontinent into at least 2 parts, which was essentially 3 parts: East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and India. And everything was split up. The finances were split up. The land was split up. Of course, the military forces were split up. But in this split, the Pakistanis did not have enough officers. They had a lot of men, but not enough officers. Premised on that, the Pakistanis used serving and retired Commonwealth officers like General Ross Cairns Mackay, who was the CGS, Chief of General Staff, and eventually served as the Chief Military Advisor to the Pakistani government in the early 1950s. It was his idea to raise the ISI, and he tasked it to another Australian. His name was Major General Walter Bill Cawthorne. Now, Bill Cawthorne was an interesting man. He'd served already as the director of India's military intelligence. This is the British Indian Army's MI section in the early 1940s. He was hired by the Pakistani Army due to the same problem, due to a shortage of officers. When he became Mackay's number 2 as the Deputy Chief of General Staff, he was tasked directly to raise the ISI. It must be emphasized here that the top 2 leaders of the ISI at the time of its founding were not Pakistanis, they were foreigners. This sets up the theme of the ISI. It sets up its orientation as well about how it works with and deals with foreign intelligence agencies, especially agencies related to the British Commonwealth and the larger Western Hemisphere. Anyways, Bill Cawthorne needed help. He had served in the region, but he needed support. And so when he was tasked by Mackay, he went on to hire this man, the first director of the ISI. Now, while Bill Cawthorne was the original OG, the first Director General of the ISI, this man effectively became the first Pakistani, the first Muslim, and the first director of this organization. He was an interesting and a colorful character. His name was, at the time, he retired a Major General, but his name at the time, his rank at the time was Brigadier General Syed Shahid Ahmed, eventually Major General Syed Shahid Ahmed, the first director of the DFI, the Directorate of Forces Intelligence, later the ISI. He was born in the central Indian city of Lucknow. He attended the famous Aligarh Muslim University, as well as the famed Sandhurst Military College in Britain. He started the DFI/ISI from a small office in Karachi. Karachi at the time was not just the capital of Pakistan, was also the headquarters of the British Indian Army's intelligence training apparatus. The British intelligence, British Indian Army's intelligence school was based in Karachi, because Karachi was a pretty good listening post. It was within shooting distance of the Persian border, the Afghan border, Central Asia, and the high seas of the Persian Gulf. Premised on that, Karachi was the chosen point of being the birthplace of the ISI, even though general headquarters was still in Rawalpindi, where it remains till this day. Anyways, when Major General Sayyid Shahid Hamid, at that time Brigadier Sayyid Shahid Hamid, took over, this was the order which was posted for his, which was signed for his posting. This is the first piece of evidence which we have, which effectively, sort of proves that the ISI was born on around the same time as the first Kashmir War was ending. Two postings were made simultaneously. Brigadier Sayyid Shahid Hamid he was tasked as the Director of Forces Intelligence, and then Lieutenant Colonel Gulzar Ahmed was tasked as the Director of Military Intelligence. The two organizations would become the right and left arms of the Pakistan Army. The Military Intelligence Organization, as we know it, has similar functions to the ISI, but a more limited ambit. As its name suggests, MI is supposed to watch the military first and everybody else next. It's got a counterintelligence network, etc. It's got a longer route. It's got a longer history in Pakistan's politics than the ISI, of course. But the MI at that time was led by a lieutenant colonel. Today, it is led by a major general. The ISI at that time was led by a major general. Today, it is led by a lieutenant general. Anyways, let's talk about the first boss, or Sayyid Shahid Hamid, or SSH, as he is known. He was a bit of a record breaker, the youngest general in the Pakistani military. That remains an unbroken record. He was posted after the ISI. Interestingly, he was posted to London as a defense attaché, which has become a bit of a tradition that the sharpest shooters, the sharpest brigadiers in the Pakistani military end up going to either London or Washington. That's become a sort of a tradition which SSH himself started. He was a complicated man, a sophisticated man. He married a socialite, Tyra Butt. Here he's seen chilling out with Richard Nixon at a social event years after his retirement. But there he is at another event getting a military briefing next to his boss, Ayub Khan. He wrote several books after retirement, and the very fact is that he is considered by most as the founding father of the ISI. 2 critical years is what he served from 1948 to 1950, but he set the tone, he set the premise, in fact, surprised many with the work he did as the first director of the ISI. In fact, in Pakistan these days, it's quite fashionable for generals, whether they are heading the ISI or the army at large, to get extensions way beyond their retirement age. SSH proves them all wrong. In 2 short years, he went on to his next posting and set up what would effectively become the most important organization within the country. He did his job, he did it within the 2-year ambit he was given, and then he moved on accordingly. He was hired in retirement by a pretty brutal man, Ziaul Haq, the Islamist dictator who ruled Pakistan from the late 70s into the late 80s. He served as a member of the federal cabinet under Zia, which personally makes me doubt his intent in his later years, but he was quite a respected and dedicated officer in his heyday, which you see him pictured in here. Now, of course, it wasn't easy. the staffing problems were the first thing that SSH and Cawthorne and McKay had to deal with. In 1947, Pakistan had a huge army, but the problem was that there weren't enough intelligence personnel. There were only 10 officers, 10 junior commissioned officers, and 102 NCOs, non-commissioned officers or other ranks. This was not a lot of manpower for one of the world's largest armies at that time. On top of that, the Brits had destroyed all important documents and intelligence records which they had kept at the headquarters in Karachi. We've seen this through the course of the years and whenever there is a transition of power. But this was a strange move by the British because they were still manning the Pakistan as well as the Indian militaries. So this was a strange move. Yes, partition was done. Yes, these two countries had come into existence, but British officers were still serving both New Delhi and Rawalpindi. So it was quite strange that the British would, on the one hand, keep their officers deployed on active duty in India and Pakistan, but on the other hand, destroy the security and intelligence records that Pakistan should have inherited. Anyways, by 1950, after its first directorship was over, the ISI had 39 members from the inter-services, including women. At that time, there were just 3 bureaus which were functional. Today, the ISI has maybe 8 to 9 wings. The data is unclear on that. But at that time, there were just 3 bureaus: the Joint Intelligence Bureau, the Counterintelligence Bureau, and the Signals Intelligence Bureau. Signals Intelligence, of course, for listening and watching, which is what they still do, and they do it quite interestingly, and they're quite well equipped. In fact, the latest firewall slash internet closure in Pakistan, as well as the military's monitoring and surveillance abilities, which are the talk of the town these days in the world's 5th largest country, all of them go back to the emphasis by the ISI on having a signals intelligence bureau. But besides that, counterintelligence at that time was, of course, just counterintelligence. Today, counterintelligence has a clear political role as well. In fact, the Counterintelligence Bureau, or the C Bureau, as it's called, is led by a man, Pakistan's former Premier Imran Khan has nicknamed Dirty Harry. His real name is, of course, not that. His real name is Major General Faisal Nasir. But his very tactics have perhaps forced the former Prime Minister to name him after the notorious Hollywood character. But premised on that, the whole idea is that back in the day, just 3 bureaus: joint intelligence, joint intelligence, counterintelligence, and signals intelligence, versus what the ISI has today. At least 8 to 9 wings, each led by a major general who are commanded by a lieutenant general. The manpower of the ISI back in 1950 was 39 officers, including women. Today, by most estimates, the ISI has upwards of 150,000 officers, men and women, subcontractors, contractors, serving military personnel, as well as civilians. It is a staggering number to compare when we look at the ISI back in 1950. Early challenges were, of course, there. The ISI was immediately drawn into politics, and this is not something of its making, but it was immediately drawn into politics with Pakistan's first coup attempt. That was the Rawalpindi conspiracy of 1951. It's a long story, but to keep it short, the man on the right side of the screen, Pakistan's first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, well, his government was seen as not a very good one by certain members of the military, and they tried to overthrow his government under what came to be called the Rawalpindi conspiracy. The man on the left of the screen at that time was the boss of the military. His name was General Frank Messavi. Unfortunately, not only could the ISI and its sister, the MI, not only did they fail in uncovering the Rawalpindi conspiracy case, which was, of course, which involved serving active duty military officers, but in fact, the case was uncovered by a police investigation, which was embarrassing for the MI as well as the ISI. In fact, the director of the MI committed suicide out of shame because of the MI's failure to uncover the coup plot. But even more shameful, which is something which is not widely reported, is that this man, the boss of the army, never was told and informed and reported to by the ISI about the Rawalpindi conspiracy case. So, this habit of running a parallel network, a parallel chain of command, a chain of command which is not necessarily answerable to the mainstream army's chain of command, this habit seems to have set in really early for the ISI, as well as the habit, of course, which continues to the day of calling civilian led dispensations and governments as bloody civilians who are not, as the mentality goes, who are not capable of running Pakistan. So, yeah, we see two habits early in the ISI's years. One is to not report the right thing to the boss. Two is to not really uncover the real problem from within the organization that it stems from. That is a wrap of the early challenges, but the early tensions also plagued the ISI. Now, Pashtun nationalism, which continues to this day and poses a threat to Pakistan's military efforts, especially in countering terrorism in the northwestern part of the country and the southwestern part of the country. Pashtun nationalism was there before the ISI. In fact, Pashtun nationalism was there right till the eve of the Pakistan movement's culmination into the Islamic Republic, or the Dominion of Pakistan, as it was initially called. Several generals, including Pakistan's first military dictator, Ayub Khan, have noted that Pashtun nationalism was a reality, but while the army appreciated Pashtun nationalism, it never really considered it an existential threat, so to say, to the Pakistani military or the Pakistani polity at that time. Things clearly have changed since then. But the ISI is blamed wrongly for fomenting Pashtun nationalism and for having an anti-Pashtun bent. Well, not sure about if I can defend the ISI's anti-Pashtun bent, but clearly Pashtun nationalism was inherited as a potential political problem by the ISI before it was founded. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the frontier Gandhi, and his brother Khan Abdul Jafar Khan, who ruled the province, were effectively not really interested in the Pakistan movement or partition. So the first thing which was on the horizon and remained so was Pashtun nationalism. They didn't invent it, but they did aggravate it. The second thing which they inherited and, of course, keep on aggravating is Balochistan. Now, the Baloch problem has come in ebb and flow and been set at the door as the military's problem. Well, it's not the ISI's problem of it was not the ISI's creation. The Baloch problem started really in the 1870s when an agreement with the Brits, between the Brits and the Khan of Kalat, effectively ended up granting semi-autonomous status to the people of Balochistan. The whole idea was that they would be a large part of the Dominion of India, but, sort of like the Nepalese are. They're there, but they're not there. They're ruled and under different cultural and legal premises. But, of course, Pakistan forcibly annexed Balochistan just 9 months after its creation because the Baloch were dilly-dallying on what to do and where to go. That was a forcible annexation. It must be said that it remains so, and that is a part of the record. But the annexation had already been conducted by the time the ISI took over. Now, the ISI is blamed for aggravating the Baloch problem. That is a fair criticism. That is a fair critique. but the ISI should not be blamed for creating the Baloch problem. And the third problem, which the ISI is also blamed for, incorrectly, is the Kashmir issue. The Kashmir War, the first Kashmir War, had already been fought before the ISI was even created. Under Operation Gulmarg, the man who had created the whole premise of irregular warfare, Colonel Akbar Khan, had already started a theme, a legacy of a smaller army fighting a larger army, Pakistan's smaller army, fighting a larger Indian army with asymmetrical warfare. Death by 1,000 cuts, special operations, and irregular and guerrilla troop movements, which are designed to, well, hurt but not kill, um, uh, uh, damage but not dismember, to keep the pot boiling. Again, here's a picture of Colonel Akbar Khan, who eventually became a major general in the Pakistani military, but and also, by the way, had a role in the Rawalpindi conspiracy case. But the whole idea of asymmetric warfare or irregular warfare, which Pakistan's ISI continues today, whether it's supporting the Taliban regime against American and NATO forces in Afghanistan, which is something they've done, or fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, which is something they've done, or supporting Kashmiri freedom fighters or Mujahideen against occupying Indian forces in Jammu and Kashmir, or even, as word has it, supporting guerrillas in Chechnya against the Russians back in the day. All of these actions of asymmetrical warfare or irregular warfare to counter a larger force go back beyond the days of the ISI. In fact, they go back to this man in the picture, Colonel Akbar Khan. So the ISI effectively did run with this theme. They did run and promote this legacy, but they didn't necessarily create it. Some early operations are also worth recounting and recalling. The first director, Sayyid Shah Hameed, ended up conducting actual intelligence tours, actual listening tours, as they're called. He went to the border in Kashmir and to the border in Sindh and the Run of Kutch. He tried to actively recruit the human intelligence assets on the ground there. The ISI also got its first hand at surveillance. It got its first shot at surveillance by covering the Soviets and the Iranian delegations, trade delegations and business delegations and commercial delegations when they visited Pakistan at the time. Of course, the first assessment, the first serious assessment that was written, the first paper that was written at the time by the ISI was on the Indians' weapons manufacturing capacity, which remained then and remains still now a source of concern for the Pakistanis. But the ISI's finest hour, as it was called by its first director, the ISI's finest hour is pictured here with the former Prime Minister, the eventually assassinated Prime Minister of Pakistan, the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, Liaquat Ali Khan, when he raised his fist and made what is called a mukkah in Urdu. And this was done right after a briefing by the ISI, after which he went and made an impromptu speech against the Indians. Well, all of this goes back to the ISI's finest hour. And what had the ISI achieved? The ISI claims to have achieved basically figuring out an Indian plan to send an armored division from the central Indian city of Meerut, which is famous for its kebabs as well as its armored divisions. But the ISI had enough human intelligence assets on the ground to figure out that an entire armored div is heading towards Pakistan and that Nehru had plans for attacking Pakistan. The ISI found this out, disclosed it to Liaquat in time. Liaquat made a fiery speech, and as the Pakistanis claim, the Indians backed off. Not only did they back off, but the Pakistanis even claim that Jawaharlal Nehru, India's Prime Minister, and Liaquat Ali Khan, Pakistan's Prime Minister, ended up making the first and last no-war pact after the ISI's disclosures. So it is considered the agency's finest hour by its first director. But again, it depends on who you believe. However, the speech was made. Liaquat did raise his fist. The fist lives on in Mukka Chowk in my hometown of Karachi. And unfortunately, just a few months after this speech, at another public speech, Liaquat Ali Khan was killed. He was assassinated, and his assassination remains a mystery till today. And by the way, that assassination happened on the ISI's watch. Moving on, the early habits of the ISI, which remain habits so far as well, are really exaggerating assessments and intelligence reports for the Americans. The first communist threats were greatly exaggerated. The Aisha Jalal, the Pakistani historian based in Massachusetts, she basically really takes the ISI to town for its early assessments of exaggerating the communist threat and premises it on, their habit of trying to secure American financial largesse, whether it was security assistance or weapons or in any form. The whole idea was very simple. The ISI's generals wanted to manufacture reports which boost the communist threat, which raised the alarm for a red threat that the commies are at the gates, and Pakistan's intelligence service is ready to provide all sorts of support in this ongoing Cold War to its American friends. That is a mentality which remains active in Pakistan's military circles even today. The idea is to establish the ISI as a strategic partner of worth, as the British academic Julian Richards writes, a partner of worth whom one in the Western Hemisphere can depend on. Of course, at that time, the reports were meant for Washington, but the main liaison at that time, which remains the liaison till today, is with the UK. Most of the ISI senior officers have trained in the UK. They continue to train with British intelligence. And of course, the best intelligence officers end up doing exactly what Brigadier Shah Hameed did, becoming the defense attaché to the Pakistan at the Pakistan embassy in London. And that sets the early habits of the ISI, which continue till today. The transition in the 50s was strange. Pakistani media records say that Cawthorne was in power till 1959. This is conflicting with actual records in Australia, where Cawthorne had actually returned. So one is not clear about who was heading the ISI. This is quite strange and raises the question, was Cawthorne running the ISI from back in Australia, or were his records fudged about his return back to the Australian intelligence agencies? This is an interesting question which remains unanswered even by the best academics. What we do know is that there was a swap in the directorship. Brigadier Shah Hameed handed over the reins to Brigadier Mirza Hameed, who is pictured here. And here is a letter on the screen from the boss of the British Army. Pardon the Freudian slip. The boss of the Pakistan Army at that time, praising the outgoing director Shahid Hameed and encouraging the incoming director Mirza Hameed. However, the head of the Pakistani military at the time also goes on to admit that the ISI has a great relationship with the British intelligence agencies. This goes on to underscore the ISI's ongoing relationship with Western intelligence agencies till today. However, not all was smooth in this transition. The ISI's records are murky, but the MI's records are not. The MI boss at the time, one of the bosses at the time, Major Zahiruddin, killed himself because out of shame for the MI's failure in not being able to handle the Rawalpindi conspiracy case. Our summary stands perhaps most importantly. From 1948 to 1958, the ISI was formed as to play a role as an inter-services coordinator for field intelligence. Its job was not to influence Pakistani politics. Its job was not to harass, kidnap, and kill journalists. Its job was not to survey and pressurize judges. Its job was definitely not to do whatever it has been up to in Pakistan of late. It was formed simply and only for inter-services military intelligence purposes. Staffing and capacity problems remained, but those are long gone. From having just 39 officers and men in 1950, the ISI has graduated on to becoming a beast within the armed forces community. In fact, the last published budget of the ISI in 2013-14 made its budget to be exactly the same size as that of the Pakistan Navy. That is right. You heard it right. The ISI's last declared budget was exactly the same size as the Pakistan Navy's. Now, the ISI fell into politics with the Rawalpindi conspiracy case, but it developed this habit of running parallel functions quite early, not really following the chain of command, the conventional chain of command with the mainstream military, but rather doing its own thing when it comes to not letting the boss in on what's going on. That's a habit which several ISI bosses have, at least a couple of them that I've interviewed, have admitted to. And that is something which the Pakistani Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, who I have also interviewed, calls wheels within wheels. That's a habit which is a bad one. And they caught on that habit quite early. The liaison with Britain remains. Britain remains a back door for the Pakistanis to Washington, as well as the rest of the Western Hemisphere. The Brits not only deployed their officers for several years to command the Pakistani military, but the Brits also imagined the ISI and put it in and created it. This is in comparison. The Brits were also serving in India at the time, but India's intelligence agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, was born several years later. In fact, a couple of decades later after the ISI. What was it that the Brits had in mind at the time about the need for an intelligence agency in Pakistan, but not in India? Keep in mind that there were British officers manning the Indian military at the time as well. In fact, the Viceroy of India, Mountbatten, ended up commanding the Indian military at the time of partition. So it's quite unclear what Britain's intentions were when the ISI was formed. But one thing remains. The ISI was not imagined or created or founded by Pakistanis. It was imagined, created, and founded by people who were not from Pakistan, who eventually left Pakistan, and who did not identify themselves as Pakistanis. And that remains something which must be debated even today. The theme of asymmetric warfare remains. That is a legacy that was not the ISI's to make, but definitely it's to bear. And the ISI, which is incorrectly blamed for Pashtun nationalism, Baloch nationalism, and the Kashmir insurgency, it inherited all those problems. The one thing that is clear, which I hope to cover in upcoming episodes, is the ISI's rivalry with civilian intelligence agencies. Believe it or not, Pakistan already had a better functioning intelligence bureau at the time. But the ISI ended up, like all agencies do, becoming a turf warrior and eventually chewing into the better equipped IB's ambit, and then, of course, taking it from there. The rest is history, which we hope to cover in upcoming episodes. That was my show for today. Next up is A bunch of fun stuff coming up about the ISI's performance in different wars, the ISI's role in politics, good, bad, and ugly bits about this all-important organization. If you are a student of Pakistani politics, you must get inside the belly of the beast, and that is what we will try to do in upcoming episodes. Share, like, subscribe, and comment. Please support independent journalism. Please support independence. Check out my membership options on the main page. Again, thank you for watching. This was meant as an exercise in thinking, free thinking, which seems to be a problem in Pakistan these days. It was premised on open source reporting. Aisha Jalal, Shuja Nawaz, Julian Richards, and other authors who have watched and studied this organization and know way more than me must be credited for being a part of the making of this report. I'm Wajahat Saeed Khan. You have been kind enough to watch Mahaz, so please share, like, subscribe, and comment. Check out our membership options, and I will see you very, very soon.